I'd like to talk a little bit about the implications of hyperinflation and, as individuals, what you can do about it to protect yourself. In 1991, I traveled down to Argentina because my sense of it was that the austral, which was the currency at the time, was about to hyperinflate.
Yep.
They had broke the link to the US dollar, 14 australs to $1 US in January of 1991. I arrived in early May, and the devaluation had already been quite severe. There were 64 australs to $1 US. When I left a week later, it had gone up to 96 australs, and by December it was 10,000 australs to $1 US. And I remember very vividly, talking to shopkeepers, particularly the concern, because they had gone through hyperinflations before and knew what they needed to do to protect themselves, but were obviously very, very worried about what they saw coming. I'd like to talk, though, a little bit about hyperinflation and, in Germany, and, what were the social consequences of that hyperinflation?
They were horrendous, I would say. You had a whole class of people, the rentier classes, the people who had savings, they were ruined. You had the professional classes unable to make any money at all. We're talking about over 3 years. You had the outbreak of crime, of corruption, and Germany had never been a corrupt country before. You had political riots all over the place, food riots, employment riots, unemployment riots. You had Hitler down in Bavaria stirring people up, saying that everything is the fault of the Jews. And there was a total social breakdown. You also had the effect of seeing people swarming in from outside, after all the war was over for 3 years, spending their money, spending foreign exchange, and be able to buy all kinds of things from everybody. You were reduced eventually to a barter economy, so that unless you had foreign exchange, you couldn't even buy food. Country was divided against town, because in the countryside there was still lots of food, but they wouldn't sell the food to the towns because they didn't want worthless paper in return. So you had class against class. You had people, your friends. You always suspected your friends were doing rather better than you were at any time, and you were suspicious of people who appeared to be able to work the system. Everybody was gambling on it who had any money, gambled on the stock exchange, because all the time people were thinking of the price of the dollar. Everything was dollars.
Well, they talked about dollars, but the dollar was still tied to gold, of course, so really that was a substitute for gold.
That's fair enough. But I mean, the point about that, everyone thought the dollar was going up all the time. But in fact, it was that the mark was going up against the dollar. My God, it's now at 1 million, it's now at 2 million, it's now 1,000 million, and so on. But in fact, it looked as if the mark was going up, but in fact the mark was going down, and the dollar was very largely retaining its value. As you say, it was in gold, and the gold. The Germans had a very strange approach to all this. They always said a gold mark equals a mark, and even the president of the Reichsbank, Dr. Havenstein, spoke of things getting back to normal, where he thought the mark would once again be worth a gold mark. They never sort of lost this idea, and in fact, at the very, very end of the inflation, when the old mark disappeared and they brought in the Renton mark, when the old mark was worth a million of what it formerly was, they achieved the idea that a mark equaled a mark simply by knocking off 12 zeros from the mark denominated in that way, so that they hung on to gold right to the end as being what mattered. And indeed, all the reparations paid by Germany to the Allies, especially to the French and the Germans, reparations for the war, they had to be paid in gold marks or in materials worth with a gold mark value. So gold remained at all times in Germany the measure of what was important to them.
The numeraire for standard of value.
Yeah.
When I was in Argentina in 1991, I only stayed in the city. I didn't go to the countryside, but I got a sense from talking to people in the city that people in the country were much better off. Was that true in Germany?
Yes. And in fact, they were better off because a lot of people in the country held mortgages which had been eliminated by the collapse of the value of the mark. They could pay off their mortgages as I say, in postage stamps. The real trouble was being a creditor. Remember the Polonius's advice to Ophelia in Hamlet: "Never a borrower nor a lender be." But you could have added in inflation, if you were going to be a borrower or lender, for God's sake, be a borrower, because the more you borrowed, the less you had to pay back. And that, of course, is true. I mean, if a central bank has a 2% inflation target, well, that's 2% of robbery. I mean, anyone who has money, whether it's the Chinese or the saver living in her flat at the top of some building in wherever, they are being robbed all the time. And unless you have some kind of specie or share which is index linked, it's going to keep its value, and they didn't have that sort of thing in Germany at the time, the debts that you have are being repudiated.